what do we mean by city, and what do we mean by resilience? So let's start with city, which is actually not as self-defining as one might think as a word. Indeed, it's a confusing word with lots of definitions. For example, a city is a geographic territory, often defined by politically drawn boundaries that create a legal thing in a space that we call a city. Sometimes these politically drawn boundaries actually follow natural characteristics. Imagine Boston separated from Cambridge by the Charles River. But these are legal, political constructs. So that's one definition of a city territorially. Another territorial definition of a city is defined by economic and social boundaries that don't actually necessarily match up with legal boundaries. Cities, sadly, are a place of stark and visible inequalities, experienced cheek by jowl. There's a lot of writing about this. I'm always struck by the prescience of Michael Harrington's The Other America, a book you wrote in 1962, but there are lots of books, lots of articles, lots of studies on this point. So cities are lots of things, which is something to keep in mind as we consider resilience in the context of cities over the next 2 days. We can ask, would resilience thinking, if widely applied, actually change the way cities operate? Would a resilient city be better for all citizens, or just perhaps for those who can afford to take advantage of a certain kind of resilience? Is resilience just the latest buzzword, but actually doesn't mean much? Indeed, will resilience be the word 10 years from now, or even 5 years from now? The Rockefeller Foundation has been the word's private funding world champion, making resilient cities one of its primary missions. Urban resilience, it says, is the capacity of individuals, communities, institutions, businesses, and systems within a city. By the way, notice all of those things are part of a city. To survive, adapt, and grow. That's the better. Build back better and grow, no matter what kinds of chronic stresses and acute shocks they experience. So note the inclusive list of individuals, communities, institutions, businesses, and systems. A lot of what is in a city. Note the use of survive, adapt, and grow. And by the way, Paul Romer, the Nobel Prize winner, economist, coined the phrase, although it was used by President Obama and his staff, particularly Rahm Emanuel, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Well, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. Why not do better out of a crisis?
Resilience and sustainability are distinct, but they are overlapping. At a theoretical level, sustainability asks, can something continue over the long term? Whereas resilience asks, can something withstand shocks? In practice, especially at the urban level, sustainability really has focused on, is something carbon efficient? Sometimes more broadly, is it resource efficient relating to water or other resources? And increasingly over the last several years, thinking very much about equity as a component of sustainability. Resilience in practice is focused primarily on disaster recovery, and you can define disasters as one-time shocks. You can define them as chronic weaknesses, like a place that's subject to frequent flooding or frequent hurricanes or things like that. The pandemic, of course, is an example of something that we need to bounce back from. What's in the center of the Venn diagram is a whole host of things, which is why it's often difficult to tease out whether you're talking about resilience or you're talking about sustainability. Climate change impacts, so changing weather patterns, changing frequency of storms, increasing the sea levels. Energy supply changes, of course, that's a question of sustainability. But it's also a question of resilience, because if oil supplies go down, all of a sudden you may have certain places that are much more deeply impacted than others. Carbon pricing similarly will have very different impacts on the cost of life or the economy of different places. And of course, equity is a factor of both, and I'll get to more of that in a moment. And therefore, there are a lot of initiatives, a lot of interventions that really are cutting across what we think about as urban sustainability and resilience. Climate change adaptation, of course, makes you both more sustainable in the sense of you can continue over the long term if you address your sea level rise risks, for example. But of course, it's a resilience opportunity. Distributed power generation is generally, not always, but generally drives towards renewable power. But of course, it also means if the grid goes down, you have a much greater likelihood of having less impact. Alternative fuels similarly often disconnect you from far off sources of energy. Social cohesion, and this is really important, and I believe it's going to be a focus later today, but we have a risk often of thinking that urban resilience and urban sustainability are both about the built infrastructure, whereas in fact, one of the key figures on this topic, Eric Kleinenberg at NYU, of course, reminded us 20 years ago that social cohesion is a major factor, both in how sustainable we are, but even more so, how populations are impacted by disasters and how quickly they bounce back. And of course, energy efficiency, one of the best ways to be insulated from things like supply shocks or energy shocks is to be highly efficient. The things that cities have to work on when it comes to sustainability are pretty much in those two buckets. You have the challenge of making existing buildings more energy efficient, converting those buildings to electricity for heating and cooling and cooking, really importantly. You have to ensure a sufficient supply of renewable power, which is a challenge because, of course, in a dense urban environment, you cannot, in fact, have buildings power themselves the way you can on an acre plot with a large home. That home with solar on the roof can be off grid, whereas an apartment building, you just can't generate enough electricity on the roof to meet the demand. And of course, promoting dense land use patterns on transportation. It's basically accentuating all of the things that already make cities efficient. Shorter distances, public transit, walking and cycling, and eventually, and of course this is true economy-wide, converting vehicles to electricity. You just have a lot more people around the world in cities, which means that any disaster in an urban area has a greater impact. You have a shift away from agriculture, which means that relatively speaking, you have fewer people in those rural areas that are generally speaking less liable, particularly to the kinds of disasters that strike coastal areas. We have better information, which means we're actually more aware of what's going on around the world. We can see it in real time, whereas even 20 years ago, it would have been a distant news report, and 100 years ago, it would have been a couple of lines in the newspaper that was probably not very accurate. We have tighter supply chains, right? And the whole world started to experience this last week with what was going on in the Suez Canal. But the extent to which our supply chains are ever tighter means that any hiccup in what supplies us reverberates through the economy in a much greater way than it might have, in only a generation ago when the supply chains weren't this tight. And of course, climate change is actually changing the frequency and the severity of many of the things that we experience, such as heat waves and violent storms. I think about resilience as having four basic flavors. There's prevention, there's mitigation, adaptation, and recovery. And this is the way I define them. You can reduce the likelihood of an event happening. You can reduce the negative impacts of an event. You can basically insulate yourself from an event by adapting to it, and you can plan to bounce back